Hey, what's up you guys, the Curious Owl here, and today I'm going to be sharing with you guys my thoughts on the very first book in the Thirst series by Christopher Pike, The Last Vampire. So the copies I have of the Thirst series are omnibuses, which include anywhere between 3 to 2 stories, I think. I think each of them include 3, but I'm a little fuzzy on whether or not the last omnibus is really just one big story. I don't remember off the top of my head, but the first omnibus at least includes 3 stories, which include The Last Vampire, Black Blood, and Red Dice. So the first book, The Last Vampire, clocks in at about 197 pages, so it's very, very short. And to give some context of the story, the series started, it was first published in 1994, which I did not know the first time I read it, and I just recently found out that when I had gone to build my TBR for June for things like the House Cup-a-thon and Feel Good-a-thon. This is a series I first started reading in high school, and because I wanted to do other reading series, kind of like how I did with the Morganville Vampires, I wanted to bring Thirst into this because not only is it another vampire-based series, but it is a vampire-based series that I had some issues with going into like the last few books of the series, because there were things that I didn't really expect happening and things that kind of came out of left field that I don't really remember how they happened. I just remember it was odd when I first read it, and I wanted to go back to the series because I wanted to, first of all, come back to a character I really seemed to like a lot when I first read it, and I also wanted to see how the real story plays out now that I'm an adult and see if I like it. And unfortunately, Book 1 was quite a disappointment. So the first book in the series, The Last Vampire, basically brings us to meeting the character named Sita, or as she is going by now in modern times in 1994 at the very least, Alyssa Pern. We learn a lot about Sita and how she became a vampire because she is now one of the only vampires left in the world, and she's 5,000 years old. She was actually one of the very first vampires to be turned. She wasn't the first vampire around, but she describes growing up in kind of what I would consider to be ancient India, essentially, and how she basically grew up with the individual who was a vampire. She basically lays out how he was born and how he started to grow up and how he eventually stole her away and turned her into a vampire. And now, years and years and years later, 5,000 years later, she knows she's one of the last vampires on Earth and gets some interesting information about how that particular vampire is now coming to kill her. She knows why, but to kind of go into that does spoil quite a few things. But I will say that there is a lot in this book that has to do, and this series in general, that has a lot to do with what I assume to be Hindu-based mythology and theology, because I've read a little bit about that here and there with other books that have been involved with it, and having gone into learning about Buddhism a little bit, I learned a little bit about Indian religion and theology kind of in that time period, and it didn't sit well with me. So here's the issue I have, is that for one, Christopher Pike is a pen name. Christopher Pike is a pen name for a man named Kevin McFadden, who is a white guy, like you can tell from the name pretty much. And he really, in the 1990s specifically, was a very big author. He had several series, he had several books that had come out over the course of the 90s and early 2000s, Thirst being one of his kind of bigger series, I guess. And I don't know if it was a big thing back then to involve theology and stories at that time, but it seemed really weird in the sense that I don't feel like there was given enough information in the first book about how this theology kind of came into it. I just felt very, very confused because Sita talks about how she meets essentially the Hindu version of Jesus Christ, who is named Krishna. And Krishna essentially tells her that if she never makes another vampire, she will have his grace. That particular moment, for some reason, I don't know if this is particularly something that does happen in like Hindu-based religious practices, but it felt so much like a Christianity-pushed version of Hinduism. And I don't know enough about it to really say whether or not that's true, but something didn't sit right with me with a lot of the description of how Sita met Krishna and what they did and kind of the things that he told her. And I don't remember much else of what happens over the course of the series that involves Krishna, but I know that he's involved in some capacity with flashbacks and things of that nature. And I just don't know necessarily whether it would be accurate to say that he would be like a Jesus Christ almost figure, where he would be, you know, everyone would be in his grace and everyone would receive his love if they, you know, adhered to like commandments of some kind or something like that. Like, I don't know, something about it just didn't sit well with me. And I feel like it would be in my best interest maybe to go and do some research on Hinduism to see if that may be something that is accurately described in the books, or if this is really a Christianized version of Hinduism that's being played into the story. Now, given the time that this book was written, it's very short. So I don't know necessarily also within that if back in the 90s, books under 200 pages, if they were really, really popular, because now we typically see in publishing books usually anywhere between 300 to 500 pages is kind of the sweet spot. There are books in especially the adult fantasy section that are much longer than that. So I don't know if necessarily in the 90s the publishing standards were to have books under 200 pages, because most of what I was seeing of Christopher Pike's work during the 90s was where he was putting out books that were about 200, less than 300 pages at the very least. And like I said, The Last Vampire clocks in at 197. And one of the things I did like about it though was that even though it was very, very quick, it did feel like there were some parts of it that did feel like it was over a larger expanse of time. However, that doesn't really change the fact though that this book was so short. It was very quick, very insta-love filled, which is something that I think in high school I had a little bit better of a time dealing with, but now, especially since I have graduated college and have really read a lot of insta-lovey stories at this point, I'm tired of it. And I think that if I was to read this for the first time now, I really wouldn't like it. This is, I think, going to be one of those series where it is not going to age well. The Morganville Vampires kind of aged better, especially as I got through more and more books. But I have a really distinct feeling that the Thirst series is going to be a series that I am going to really dislike more now than I did in high school. Truthfully, I couldn't tell you what it was about this series that drew me to it when I read it in high school. I don't even know exactly how I got into it. I just picked it up, I guess, at one point and read it, and I really connected with Sita. That is one of the main things I really liked, was I liked the character Sita, but I couldn't tell you for the life of me why I continued with the series and why I ended up getting the 5 omnibuses of the series, because now I truly dislike it. There were so many issues I had with just the writing style, from Sita's language and the way that she spoke. Like, I know she's a 5,000-year-old vampire, but you would think that a 5,000-year-old vampire would understand that language changes and she has to be able to speak in a way to people that she's interacting with in like present time. She has to pick up on the vernacular. She has to pick up on the language patterns, because how else is she going to keep people from thinking she's a vampire? And at the same time, she almost willingly, at any point in time she interacts with any human, almost directly tells them that she's a vampire. I just feel like this book was really trashy. Like, this is, I think, one of the trashiest vampire stories I've read in a long time, and that's on a reread. So I don't really know why high school me liked this. I'm very confused. Like, how did I like this series so much when the first book is nothing but trash? I will say the plot of the story I actually did enjoy. I liked the idea of having the first created vampire coming off and killing off his spawn, and Sita being the last one, having it be a story that kind of goes off with a bang, but it was a whimper. There was no bang. There was barely any spark. It was just... So needless to say, I really disliked it. There were a couple things, like I said, that I think I still enjoy in terms of the story. Like, I still think I like Sita for the most part. The writing is not necessarily, I think, on par with what I would expect from a 5,000-year-old vampire, so that's kind of irking me. And I did like the general idea of the plot, but I think that this is a story that is not aging very well in terms of seeing what I have seen from more recent contemporary pieces that also deal with vampires and things of that nature. I just feel like this is a series that's not going to stand up to the standards I have now. So I ended up giving The Last Vampire a 2 out of 5 stars because, like I said, I think that in some ways it was still fairly interesting. It definitely did leave me feeling like I wanted to get to the next book. It just felt like, for one, it was too short. I didn't care for the writing and how Sita was portrayed in a lot of ways, and I definitely am not sitting well with the Hindu Christianized kind of thing that might be happening in the story. But again, I think I need to go into studying a little bit more on Hinduism itself to see if it is being actually accurately portrayed in the story, or if it is really a very Christianized form of Hinduism. If you guys have read any of this series and you have thoughts on it, please let me know down in the comments below what your thoughts are, because I'd like to get some other perspectives on this, as this is a series that I think nobody has really ever heard of because it's so old. And I think that it only got reprinted into omnibuses to kind of give another boost to it. And that was about the time that I think I had found it, was when it had been reprinted into the omnibus versions. But I would like to know if there are any older readers out there that may have read this series, what they thought of it, and if maybe you've reread it recently, what your thoughts are on it. Because I think that for a lot of people who may have read this when they were younger, older versions of them would definitely not like this as much, because I think that's been a major pattern with some of these older stories, is like you read them for the first time when you're younger, when you kind of get into this kind of stuff, and then when you get older you see that it's not nearly as good because you've read so many other books that are similar to it or have similar themes to it, and they just do it better. So let me know down in the comments below if you guys have read this, your thoughts, and if you guys did enjoy this video, please do give it a big thumbs up, and if you're not already and you'd like to be, hit that button down below and subscribe to become an owlet in our flock, and I will see all of you guys in my next video. Bye guys.